All righty, well, super. Thank you, Ramanan. As Ramanan indicates, I've been here about a year and a half, but teaching a hydrogen economy course for about 3.5 years. And I'm going to really talk today about geosciences and I guess I'll call it now the so-called energy transition. And so how do the two overlap, regardless of the different scenarios that we will be coming up with? And so you heard during lunch that those scenarios can vary widely. And to get into the talk, we'll talk quite a bit about the steps, which are the stated policies that the IEA is looking at in terms of the way forward in energy. But then there's also the pledges, the promised pledges. And so we've been running experiments since COVID or so in terms of what is really happening out there in the marketplace with the pledges. Well, here we go. That's me. And I call that sort of the heaven on earth. And so if you look at what's happened over the last few years, various companies have made commitments over and above what the policies will support in terms of decarbonizing, but they haven't really been rewarded in the marketplace. The marketplace really doubles down on the economics that go with the policies. And so that's been something to keep in mind in terms of going forward about how do we really move forward with the policies that we need to succeed in this space. And then there's the net zero. You'll see a lot of net zero by 2050 slides. And that is what you would have to do to get to net zero. But we've got no plan of how we're going to do that currently. And so that's strictly aspirational, and keep that in mind as we go forward. So again, I lecture at a hydrogen economy course. I give a lot of slides, and so you'll get copies of these. Don't worry about taking notes on the slides today. I'm also running the hydrogen mobility pilot for Christine. And so reach out to me if you want to sign up to be looking at fuel cell mobility options in the Houston area. We're forming a group. We've got a DOE grant. We'd love to have you join us. So we've already heard this from Scott. Industrial revolution was coal. We've moved away from fossil fuels as an aspiration, but they still underpin our economy, and we're attempting to grow our renewable energies as a way forward in this energy space. The key issue is that as we move to renewables, they're not storable, and that's where the challenge lies in. This is the net zero plan of how we will transition away from oil and gas and be adding those renewables. There's a lot of technology change in there. For the first time, we're making electricity directly from wind and solar. We don't have to burn a fuel, go through the Carnot inefficiency. And so that's really great, but it's great for instantaneous energy. The problem that comes in is the high cost of storage as we try to balance this in our economy. Where we've come from is that most of our energy is coming from about 9 large basins in the world, which are traded internationally in terms of coal, oil, and gas. It's going to change going forward. On the upper left, you see where the high renewable intensity, the combination of wind and solar and capacity factors exist. It's not in the same places in the world where we're getting oil and gas. In the middle, you see again an energy density plot. You can barely find the lithium-ion batteries. The fuels and vectors that we are using have much higher energy density. And so you can look at this opportunity space as how do you use those vectors to get renewable energy transported and stored across the world. This lecture is about hydrogen. Hydrogen is one of the best of the vectors. I tell my class, electrify first if you can, but when you need the storage and when you need the transport, hydrogen is the next best vector because you can make it cleanly and you can use it cleanly. And so we'll talk about that as we move forward today. This is that latest Outlook 2024 from the IEA on the World Energy Outlook. And you see, again, the steps scenario on the left there. We're hardly changing our oil and gas demands currently in terms of the response to the stated policies. The APS, the stated policies that have no really economic underpinnings. So that's saying, I want to be good. I'm going to quit drinking and gambling. Be nice. We're going to end wars. We're going to essentially deal with poverty. All the things that we pledge we want to do. But if you don't have policies to underpin an economic value to those pledges, we're good at pledges, but we don't always come true with our pledges. So that's what the middle ground is there. And then the right is the net zero emission scenario. So a poll was done in the developed world, I think it was in the US, of how much were people really willing to spend on dealing with climate change. And it was about 2 dinners out a month for a family. But when you look at the cost, it is half of your discretionary income. And so people have not really come to grips with how expensive it is to transition to net zero. So keep that in mind with the policies. What we see on the hydrogen side, on the right hand, is that the blue line there, deep blue right underneath the light blue, is the anticipated growth in hydrogen. And what we saw coming out of COVID was a lot of interest in hydrogen as aspirational, but after looking at the cost factors, it's really waned slightly in terms of ability to commit beyond the pledges to deploying those options. Case in point on the left, so it varies globally. Currently, if you look at gas prices in the US, I drew in the red line there for $1 a kilogram hydrogen. That's the DOE's goal for what the hydrogen price we want to get to. It's currently significantly higher than that. But if we get to that price, that's $8.8 a million BTUs. That's extensively above the natural gas price here on the Gulf Coast. Without policies, you just can't afford to be paying 2.5 to 3 times more for energy. You'll go out of business because global competition is absolutely brutal. If you look at the middle in terms of the prices in Asia and in Japan, you find that they're relying upon imported LNG. Their energy prices are high. You can almost afford to have hydrogen as a vector there. So as a consultant on global projects, I see people putting in either green hydrogen via electrolysis to ammonia to be shipping to Japan from energy research regions, or blue hydrogen, which could come from the Gulf Coast with methane, natural gas reforming, and carbon capture and storage, but shipping it to Japan because that's where the policy incentives are for uptake. If you look on the left, I worked on biofuels for 10 years at Shell. Shell spent $1 billion on it back when we thought oil prices may be $100, $120 a barrel. They're never predicted to come below that again. Why? Because of fracking, light, tight gas and oil. We've unlocked that, and those, we will always have to have an incentive to implement biofuels in the US because of that. And so think about that in terms of the policy. Hydrogen as that opportunity space. We've already heard about natural hydrogen this morning, and so we don't need to talk about that. There's actually several forms of it, from the orange of injecting water to induce some of the hydrogen formation, to the white, which is already there, and then to the gold, which is the microbial conversion of hydrocarbons in the oil wells that exist. So many different approaches to what the subsurface geologic hydrogen can be. People are talking about, well, what's the best way to make it today? Should we be reforming natural gas and doing CCS, or we should be moving to the more expensive renewable electricity and doing electrolysis? So about 2 years ago, it was nearly even. And in the earlier scenarios that I had showed you, it's really tipping a little bit more towards electrolysis and renewables than the natural gas. So here's the DOE's plot of how we're trying to get that $1 a kilogram hydrogen. There's the cheat sheet for my class. $1 a kilogram is a gallon of gasoline equivalent in fuel cost, but it's also $8.8 a million BTUs in terms of natural gas. So you have to keep those factors in mind in terms of looking across the space here. We've heard this morning the IRA has passed very supportive legislation in terms of supporting low carbon hydrogen, but the scales tip a little bit towards the electrolysis versus the natural gas and reforming because the way that was written and credited. And a big part of the issue is the methane emissions in the natural gas supply chain. And so what the producers have to be doing in order to make that effective is really tighten down on those emissions and then giving credit for it. Because methane has up to 25 to 100 times more damaging global warming potential than does CO2, depending upon your time frame, and small leakage rates can be an issue. Very controversial studies being published out of academia and around the world on what those emission rates are. This is a group that I've worked with across the world who's kind of a balance set, and they still see it's really borderline for natural gas reforming unless we really tighten down on those emissions and move with advanced technologies such as partial oxidation for the reforming of the methane, where you can capture most of the CO2 coming out and get really high capture efficiencies. It can also impact where do you want to produce the oil from, because what you see now are companies are going in and picking their prime plays basis the lower CO2 footprints. And so if you look at what the emissions are as a function of where you're producing oil and gas from, offshore tends to be lower in terms of CO2 footprints and methane emissions. And so you see companies really right-sizing their asset bases in order to be looking at and doing it. One of the things that hydrogen can be really good at is a storage vector, not just for a short duration, but also seasonal. So speaking of Utah, that has one of the brand new salt dome storage sites. So California is trying to decarbonize with renewable energy. They have no salt domes. And so there is one in Utah, and you can actually grid that energy that far between Utah and California. And so that is one of the new plays in terms of salt dome storage for hydrogen. So that's something that those of you in the geosciences can focus on. Here's a map in the upper right about the salt areas within the U.S. and then the various salt projects there in the middle. And we are blessed with some of the best salt in the world here around the U.S. Gulf Coast. And so if you look at, this is now that purely speculative net zero emission scenario in terms of how much hydrogen transmission can be occurring, and also underground storage of hydrogen using these geological formations. And so opportunity space from a growth in demand. Also looking at carbon capture and storage. Also now, this is again that net zero emissions roadmap. We don't have a clue to how to get there, but if we did get there, there would be a lot of CCS and there would be a lot of hydrogen manufactured by that route with carbon capture and storage. Opportunities to keep in mind. This is the Net Zero America study from that was Princeton University, and you find amongst the various opportunities for sequestration, most of it is really coming along the Gulf Coast because of the opportunity to play in the depleted hydrocarbon reservoirs. There's a map from Scott's group on what some of that looks like in our area here now. And managing how you do that. So induced seismicity, a good calculation and approach from my colleague Mark Zobak at Stanford on how you can perhaps succeed at predicting what some of that seismicity will be, and perhaps the mathematics isn't that difficult. We know a lot of the geology in these depleted reservoirs to be able to manage those issues. Now people say CCS hasn't been done. You know, I work for Shell, and we've been doing it for up to 7 years now at a million tons a year, and did it quite successfully. There was a little bit of cost overruns on the engineering side of the construction, but the injectivity and the lack of seismicity was done well. And so hopefully we got the geology right, but I think it's really, really important. If you want to do a CCS project, you got to know what your injectivity and seismicity is. You cannot build a surface facility and then not be able to inject and store, because the costs just go out of the roof if you have that. So you really got to be able to predict the geology and the injectivity with high accuracy in order to make that happen. This is another plot from the looking at Commitments, again, the top bar is the stated policies. We don't have too many. The pledges, if we're going to live in an ideal world, we could have more. And if we really wanted to get net zero, we would have a heck of a lot more even pledges. And the bottom line here is CCS plays a very strong role in that play, and hydrogen is a big portion of where that CCS is coming from. I'm also on a National Academy study team about carbon capture utilization versus storage. So you geologists may worry, well, maybe we'll utilize it rather than storage. But you thermodynamicists, I would say, it takes a heck of a lot of energy to turn CO2 into a useful hydrocarbon. And it may take something like 4 times the number of solar or wind farms versus just electrifying. And that shows up in the National Academy report. So you may find CO2 utilization, but you're probably better off decarbonizing the grid first. And you would probably consider storing it first, because it takes a lot less energy to store it than to try to convert it into a useful material. Decarbonizing chemicals, carbon capture and storage comes into play there. Again, a good geologic play. Negative emissions, so people don't like pipelines, they don't always like CCS, but they love negative emissions, even if that requires pipelines and CCS. And so that is something that, because the thought of taking it out of the atmosphere and making it happen is really attractive to the population. So to make a summary short, there are good blue hydrogen plays today to be moving clean hydrogen from natural gas and CCS primarily to Japan as a market. Certainly CCS is challenged. You better get the injectivity and seismicity correct in your project, or you'll be in trouble. Direct air capture is quite an option at a Sustainable Aviation Fuels conference. If you look at how expensive it is to produce sustainable aviation fuel from CO2 or even some of the bioresources, you could consider just pulling it out of the air and using petroleum and taking that offset, because the two are starting to get close together in overall cost. You've really got to worry about the methane emissions if you're managing that natural gas supply chain to be competitive. Hydrogen storage in salt domes is wonderful for that seasonal, and do that where you can. And always electrify first, but hydrogen is the next important vector. So to quote from, I think, a Mad Magazine exercise, the good and bad. I don't know who of you took the Mad Magazine back in the 70s, but you always say there's a good side and a bad side, but if you're in the geosciences, you win either way, because either you're producing a lot more oil and gas continuing, or we're going to go way over and do a lot of capture, sequestration, but hydrogen will be in the middle of that in terms of an energy vector playing there, and also in the subsurface storage. So you can't lose by being in the geosciences. That's my talk for today, Ramanan.